All right, everyone. Happy Monday. It is time for Weather Where You Are, and we are going to be talking a little bit about the tropics. Hurricane season officially started on Saturday. And if you were with us a couple of weeks ago when we got the latest outlook from the from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, say that 5 times fast, then you know that we are expected to have a hyperactive season, an overactive season, and the latest from the National Hurricane Center, they will give you advisories every once in a while about El Nino and La Nina. We are currently still under an advisory for El Nino, but we are expected to transition into what we call an ENSO neutral phase, which is essentially you're not in a strong El Nino, but La Nina hasn't developed yet. You're somewhere right in the middle. We are expected to transition into that within the next couple of months, and then eventually we have about a 70% chance that La Nina will develop during the peak of hurricane season as we head into August and September. So while sometimes it's definitely not unusual to have tropical development even before hurricane season starts, so while it might be a little bit quiet right now, we'll have an update on exactly what's happening in the Atlantic and Atlantic Basin in just a couple of minutes here. While it might be quiet right now, I do anticipate, especially as we head into the next couple of months and head closer to that peak season when we do transition into La Nina, for things to really ramp up, and that's where those numbers are really going to prove true that we're supposed to have a hyperactive season. So let's kind of talk about El Nino first, because again, that is where we are currently sitting right now, and usually in an El Nino, in the winter months, that gives us here in the southeast a cooler and wetter setup. But in hurricane season, that usually leads to a quieter season. And so the reason is, as you go out to the central Pacific, the equatorial Pacific, you have warmer than normal water temperatures. And so ultimately, when you have a warmer Pacific, that usually means a slightly cooler Atlantic. Now, the thing is, our Atlantic waters are not cool. In fact, they're extremely warm. However, in a weaker El Nino situation, you actually do get some cooler than normal temperatures coming off of South America, and we are seeing that. So as the Earth is always trying to maintain balance, with this weaker El Nino and starting to see some of that cooler water come off of South America, that is leading to that ability for the Earth to kind of maintain that balance and keep the Atlantic nice and warm. But we are seeing a warm central Pacific, which is key when it comes to El Nino. Now, when that happens, we actually have the jet stream, that really quick tunnel of wind on the upper levels of the atmosphere, that actually shifts a little further south, which gives us the more active winter because that pushes all of the weather systems down. Now, that didn't happen this year in as big of a way as we thought. But nonetheless, when it comes to the tropics, when you have that jet stream further south, what that does is, as those winds are very quickly moving from west to east, as these tropical systems are running into it, that shears them apart and tears them apart. Tropical systems do not thrive in highly sheared environments. And in El Nino, with that jet stream a little further south, that ultimately tears apart storms, which leads to that slightly less active season because storms just don't have quite the advantage to develop. Now, another piece of the El Nino story when it comes to the tropics is high pressure is usually weaker because that jet stream is a little further south. That prevents that area of high pressure from really developing in a strong way. It kind of shears that apart too. So storms develop a little further north, and then they get curved around that high because that high, we call the Bermuda high, that steers systems. And when that's really strong, that can actually steer storms usually underneath through the Caribbean, underneath Cuba, and then up into the Gulf, where they explode in strength because the Gulf is still bathwater right now, very warm. But when you have an El Nino setup, it usually prevents those storms from going around that strong high because the high just isn't as strong. Now, the Atlantic is still warm. And so doesn't mean that when you have an El Nino situation, you're not going to have any tropical development. You just don't have quite the same environment that's favorable for tropical development like La Nina. So right now, we are still in an El Nino situation. That is the phase we are in. So that kind of explains in some way why we haven't had anything pop up just yet. However, as we see some of these fronts move through, which we are going to see one come through late week, sometimes you'll get lows to develop off of that, and our water is definitely warm enough for development. So something we're going to be watching as we continue through El Nino, but as I mentioned, we are expected over the next month or so to transition into a more neutral phase and then ultimately into La Nina. So our chances of tropical development, not only as we head towards peak season regardless, but just with the overall global setup that we have, you pair it with our just usual progression of hurricane season, plus us transitioning into La Nina, I do expect things to really ramp up in the next couple of months as we go through this new hurricane season. So let's talk about La Nina. Ultimately, you have these winds coming off of the coast of South America. We call them trade winds. They start to speed up. So what happens is the ocean water on the top that's really warmed by the sun, that gets kind of scooped off. So think about when you're kind of frosting a cake and you take the nice spatula and you get that first layer off, and that allows the layers underneath to show through. Essentially, what happens is the trade winds off of South America, they speed up and take that layer of really warm water off the top. Well, as the Earth is trying to maintain balance, that does include the ocean, you get the cooler water from the bottom to what we call upwells. So then that creates that cooler signature of ocean water off of South America. Well, when that happens and that continues to spread and kind of take over, heading closer to that central Pacific, the more equatorial Pacific, that's when you're like, okay, we're in La Nina. The water is a lot cooler over there. So then the Earth recognizes that, our atmosphere recognizes that and says, okay, well, we need to balance things out a little bit. So the Atlantic heats up in a big way. Well, also on that front, you have an area of high pressure develop off of the coast of California, so off of the Pacific coast. And that creates a huge kink in the jet stream and keeps it further north. And essentially, when the jet stream is further north, that doesn't shear apart storms quite as much. So you take the wind shear factor out in a big way when you have La Nina develop. You have the cooler water off the Pacific. Earth is trying to maintain a balance, so the Atlantic heats up, and then you have the jet stream shift further north, so then you're getting the lack of wind shear. And that just is the perfect storm, no pun intended, for tropical development. So as we transition into La Nina, the ocean water already extremely warm. I think that's just going to be the perfect collaboration to have that hyperactive season that we are expecting. This report from the National Hurricane Center that came out a week ago about the advisory of us transitioning into that more neutral phase and then ultimately transitioning into La Nina just in time for the peak of hurricane season. Let's talk about where the current ocean temperatures are sitting right now. And this is what I'm talking about. We're already very warm. Now, one of the meters down here, the Keys, has already recorded a 90-degree ocean temperature. So it's bathwater along the Gulf Coast right now of Florida and along the panhandle as well. Now, conditions for tropical development or I should say sea surface temperatures that are really conducive for tropical development, usually around 84 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And we are seeing that in a handful of spots, especially in the central Gulf there, and also in the Caribbean. If we take you down a little further south where you see the pink color, that's where we're looking at about 90-degree water temperature. Now, we don't know how deep the water is there. I have not looked at the ocean gauges out there, so the water could be more shallow, which would ultimately allow it become a little bit warmer. But nonetheless, in this region, you can see a handful of 85s, 89s over near Hispaniola, Dominican Republic and Haiti, Cuba. And so that little corridor there is already plenty warm enough. Again, 84 degrees is kind of that magic number when it comes to hurricane development, water being warm enough. Now, it doesn't need to be 84 degrees, but that's just the magic number, kind of. That's favorable. That's like our sunny and 75 and low humidity. 84 is the hurricane version of we like that, right? That's what we need to thrive and be happy. So seeing a lot of those numbers already out there, and hurricane season has just started. And we're seeing those warmer temperatures in areas where this time of the year tropical systems are most favorable for developing. These are the tropical development zones for June along that Caribbean corridor there, the Gulf, and then along the Atlantic coastline, where a lot of times we'll have cold fronts move through, like I mentioned, and as they push off the Atlantic coast, sometimes they'll stall, and then we'll get little kind of waves of energy to form off of them and take advantage of some of that wind shear take advantage of some of the spin that helps create these storms, and they'll develop. So we watch fronts very carefully this time of year because a lot of times you can get these lows to develop along them and then ultimately turn tropical in nature. So something we'll be watching. As of right now, though, as of today, as of this morning, no tropical activity is expected right now. Not in the next couple of days, not expected in the next 7, but doesn't mean we're not watching very carefully. Already seeing kind of a burst of convection just north of San Juan there that's trying to spin a little bit. So we'll be keeping an eye on it. Definitely potential with how warm the water is right right now, just in general. So if we do have a named storm, here's a look at the hurricane names. I know we discussed this when we talked about the start of hurricane season, but Alberto is the first name on the list. If we do have any storms develop, of course, they have to become tropical storm strength before they get a name. First, they get numbers. And that's a list of all of the names. And I was convinced that Alberto had been expired or retired because I guess it had to have been in recent past. I believe Alberto caused quite a bit of damage along the Gulf Coast. But there it is on the list of names. And we will continue to monitor the evolution of El Nino transitioning back into La Nina. Usually that happens over a span of a few years. El Nino will stick around for a couple of years because we're talking about bodies of water and temperature changing. So that's obviously a lot of water, and water heats up and cools down slower than the ground does. So usually it does take years for these to transition. So a little strange that we are going from a very short El Nino. The El Nino only started last year, and we're already transitioning back into La Nina. So that's definitely not normal, but we will be monitoring all of it for you as we make our way through this new hurricane season that started on Saturday. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining me for Weather Where You Are. We'll continue to track the tropics and, of course, track your forecast here at home as we make our way through the week right here on Atlanta News First Plus. So be sure to tune in every time we're on air, every time you get that notification that we're on. Make it a wonderful Monday, everyone, and we'll catch you here next time.